Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about the costs of cloud computing, which is a more mysterious subject than it needs to be. Specifically, we're looking at how to manage those costs, including in a multi-cloud environment. To discuss that, I'm joined by Asim Razzaq, CEO of Yotascale. Asim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
I think the idea of cloud costs is far more confusing and mysterious to companies than it needs to be. I think they get worried about their invoice. I know one person who makes his living simply looking at cloud invoices to see what the companies can cut. So certainly cost is an issue. As you survey the costs related to multi-cloud, what are a couple of key trends? What's going on in the market as you see it?
Yeah, as you mentioned, James, cost is for cloud is starting to become a big issue. It's increasingly the second line item after payroll. So companies' percentage of revenue, their profitability, their margins, the health of the business is dependent on it because it's increasingly becoming a digital infrastructure, a digital world. And as you mentioned, multi-cloud, what we're seeing in terms of trends is that it's increasing. The adoption is increasing more and more, especially with enterprise customers. And the adoption is for several different reasons, right? It could be, especially in the B2B companies, that your customers might be in a certain industry, and that might be more conducive to one cloud provider versus another cloud provider. If you're a SaaS company, you kind of need to be in a bunch of these. And so it's hard enough to really reel in the cost of one cloud, not to mention now you have multiple one of these. And
Mm-hmm.
so trends we're seeing is that the adoption is also in part because there's specialization that's going on in each cloud,
Hmm.
right? So some clouds, like I would say GCP is really good at machine learning analytics. AWS, Amazon tends to be very good at core infrastructure. Microsoft Azure, if you have Office 360, then that's a good package with respect to Microsoft because Azure comes as part of that, and there are discounts that companies can leverage there. So the biggest challenge a lot of companies start facing when they start adopting multi-cloud is that there are differences in these cloud providers. There are different services, right? And making sure you can contextualize the cost in terms of how you run the business is very hard. And what I mean by that is that each company has its way of looking at its business. So they might look at it as product, domain, services, teams, owners. They might look at it as cost of goods sold, which might be different. They might look at regional cost because if you're a multinational company, you have you have these cloud providers in different regions, and ensuring that you leverage that business context at the company level, at an application level, at a team level, and map every single resource to the right cost center, every single resource to the right business context. And for scale, like sometimes you have millions of moving resources in across these different cloud providers that you have to make sure that you reel in and dynamically attribute. I think that's one key trend. The other trend that starts making it that's happening in parallel, that's starting to make this increasingly complex, is this adoption of cloud native Kubernetes containers,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Right.
what companies are doing is for agility, for deployability, for doing cloud management, basically for delivering software at the speed of DevOps, right? They have to adopt these technologies. And in the words of one of our customers who's in a DevOps team, he goes like, "I love Kubernetes, but it's a financial black hole,"
Oh,
meaning
oh, it
that
is. People actually view Kubernetes that way as a major expense.
it's an expense. I mean, but it's hard to connect the dots back to those concerns, right? Which service, which application, which product, which business unit does this belong to? So I love Kubernetes myself, right? I'm a recovering engineer, so I love that technology. But making sure that it gets attributed to the right services and context becomes challenging because there's this emergence of this shared PaaS layer, right? Meaning that different teams can share the infrastructure, but it's hard to figure out what team consumed which resources,
Hmm.
right? So I think there are all the business reasons, there are all some of the high level economic reasons for having multiple clouds, but you also have to reel it in because the complexities can get out of hand, and you got to get the single pane of glass view of how do you figure out where the money is going, how do you make trade-offs, how do you become strategic with respect to leveraging it.
Well, I mean, I guess you've provided a lot of insight already. I'd love to get your answer though to how can companies economize or otherwise spend more efficiently on multi-cloud? I think that's that is the answer. You've talked about it a bit.
Yes.
What is your insight on that one?
I think it starts back to what I was saying, that understanding what are the lens that you're putting on it, right? So understanding what are the sensitivities to your economics, right? So again, if it's applications, if you're running a particular application and it is not a big percentage of bringing revenue in, and it's just consuming resources and costing a bunch of money, you're going to make different trade-offs. So that enterprise context, that enterprise hierarchy, that enterprise way of looking at where the money is going in the context of business is important. That's step number one. That is very, very, very important, right?
Well, how do I mean? Can you give an example of that? Like, so it's going in this direction, which means what in terms of economizing?
Yeah, it's making trade-offs. It's making trade-offs, right? So if you have a monolithic view and you get the bill shock at the end of every, like let's say you have three cloud providers and you get the bill shock from three cloud providers, and
Right.
you're just trying to scratch your head, especially in finance or budget owner, like where is this money going and why, right?
Hmm.
So for you to have that ability, you want to divide it into, I'll give you a simple example. You have production, right? And
Right.
you have dev, you have QA, and you might have sales enablement, right? Where you do your POCs and stuff. If you don't have a very good granular accurate view of those environments as to how much each is costing, you're not going to be able to make those trade-offs and have the conversation, because maybe there's a lot of wastage that's happening in dev and QA, right? And you need to make sure the dev and QA teams know here are the actions they can take to reel the costs in.
Hmm.
Similarly, on the production side, that represents COGS, cost of goods sold, right? So if you don't have a view of what each customer is costing you, you're not going to be able to really figure out, are you profitable with this customer or are you not? And then you're going to have to make those trade-offs. And I think the other thing is you have to leverage a lot of the consumption-based economics with each cloud provider. So there are savings plans, there are reserve instances, which means that if you commit to a certain usage, then you will get discounts. There are EDPs, enterprise discount pricing, where if you commit to, let's say I'm going to spend $10 million a year on one particular cloud provider, then
Hmm.
they could give me 10, 15, 20% off of that,
Hmm.
right? So that committed usage is another key part of this. And the third one I would mention is that by far a lot of times what's happening in these cloud environments is dormant resources
Mm.
not being leveraged, right? They just get left behind in the wake of, you had a spike, you had to provision resources, and now you're sitting there, just the bill is still, the clock is ticking, right? The meter is going, but
Hmm.
those resources are not doing a whole lot. But again, having the right information to know what are those type of resources that you should shut down and not use anymore, that's another critical aspect of ensuring that you have the economies of scale in place.
Isn't it ironic that there would be dormant resources that would draw, money away from the company, and that, the old days with data centers, of course, there were all sorts of dormant resources, but with the cloud, it's all infinitely scalable. So we don't need to buy things we're not going to use that month. So, and yet still in the cloud, we still have dormant resources.
Yes. So that goes back to sort of my take on this, which is there is a promise of the cloud and there is a reality of the cloud. The
Hmm.
promise of the cloud was, and sometimes people think it continues to be, is that you have it be elastic, right? Like it expands as you need and it shrinks as you need automatically. Well, the reality of it is that a cloud provider is not going to shrink your resources because they don't know what your needs are. Maybe you have the resources dormant because it is a backup failover cluster. It's just sitting there in case there is a failover you need to do. It's not a hot. Maybe it can be, but that's a legitimate reason to do this. It might be because you are preparing for a spike next week because your team is going to launch in Europe and you're just testing the infrastructure. So I think a lot of that context the cloud provider is not going to have. So the monkey's on your back to figure out and make sure that you are driving the right strategy to do that. I mean, I also say that cloud providers do provide some basic capabilities there. So one thing is called auto scaling, where the resources can grow as the traffic grows. But the problem with auto scaling is that it scales up pretty well, but it doesn't scale down too well. And so that tends to be a challenge as well.
Well, it sounds like obviously it's going to be the IT department or the tech staff that is actually going to be scaling it down. Even those folks might not know what the business side of the business, the business execs are thinking. So maybe it's, correct me if I'm wrong, is part of it the relationship between the tech staff and the business folks, or not necessarily?
It's all interconnected. It absolutely is, right? So you have to democratize the information and you have to pass it to the edges. So our ethos, at least at Yotascale, is that you have to be able to empower engineering teams. So you have this rise of platform engineering teams, you have this rise of application engineering teams, service engineering teams, you have microservices, you have Kubernetes, all this stuff going on, right?
Mhm.
But ultimately, the best strategy is when you can make teams accountable and own their own costs. Because if a central team is trying to chase everybody, you don't have a pretty good shot. You don't have a good shot at really reeling it in. Because
Mm.
as you just said, you don't know why they have taken certain decisions, why there are certain architectural decisions, why there are certain business decisions, why there are certain infrastructure decisions.
Mhm.
So my belief is that companies that are very, very successful in this are the ones that can attribute the cost correctly, the data is accurate, what cost belongs to what team, they can deliver that information in near real time to those teams, and those teams are then responsible for taking action on an ongoing basis. I think that is the role of a central team. And a central team is helpful in terms of negotiating the contracts for sure, right? Because they have the 360 view of, okay, how much we're spending each month and what committed usage should we go with.
Mhm.
But they don't they're not enabled enough to go in and shut down resources or take certain action for the application infrastructure teams, because they just don't know what the consequences might be.
Mhm. Well, let's look at Yotascale itself. Your company. I mean, how is Yotascale addressing the multi-cloud needs of its clients? I mean, what is the Yotascale advantage?
Absolutely. So this trend of multi-cloud and containers, those two combined, it goes back to we have built one of the most sophisticated attribution engines in the industry, which is dynamic, right? So we can take data from third-party systems. So we can take data from ServiceNow, a CMDB, Active Directory, where ownership actually lives, right? That is where the organizational hierarchy is. That is where all the information for business context tends to be. So we can take all of that and we can really map it on an ongoing basis to your cloud spend for multiple clouds. So we don't take as primary the view that, okay, this is AWS, GCP, Azure. The primary view for us is, what is the view for the company, right? So as an
Mm.
example, the view could be, you have different domains or business units, right? Underneath that, there are different applications. Underneath that, there are different services. Underneath those services, there are teams, and then they have owners, right? So we make sure that that view on an ongoing basis, dynamically across your multiple clouds, across your Kubernetes container layers, is kept up to date and accurate. And it's delivered not only to the central teams, but to the teams at the edges. So the teams get the right data at the right time to the right people. And this information can be delivered through Slack, through Microsoft Teams. And then we are able to provide, so let's say you're an analytics team, you're a lead on an analytics team, you
Mhm.
know exactly precisely what the cost of your infrastructure is, and we
Mhm.
give you actionable recommendations. So we respect the engineering teams, right? And in those actionable recommendations, we give you scenarios, which is, hey, you can actually save a ton of money and have very little headroom if you take option one,
Hmm.
or you can save less money and have more headroom, right, if you take option two, because we're helping them make those trade-offs, because they're in the best position to make those trade-offs and then implement those in a very quick manner and just move on. So that's how we help companies reel this in.
Does that mean that Yotascale it must have observability throughout all the company's multi-cloud deployments with AWS or Azure or GCP? I mean, does the Yotascale software literally reside with those cloud players or not necessarily?
It doesn't necessarily have to reside with those cloud players, because in the world of SaaS, we can connect and we can consume information. So even if we are in an AWS or a GCP or Azure, we can consume the information from the corresponding clouds, right? But I
Yeah.
love your use of the term observability, because it is key and critical, and that is how we have a view of the world. Observability is a term that's borrowed from security, performance, increasingly in infrastructure networking. And we believe in cost also. You have to have cost observability, right? Because
Hmm.
you have to get down to the finer grain level, and you have to be able to go across these multiple cloud providers. So we're able to, as a SaaS-based company, consume a lot of that information, regardless of where we are deployed. Of course, we're deployed in a secure, enterprise-centric environment.
And I don't know if this relates to your business, but you obviously must have a really clear view of the three players, in addition, probably the secondary players as well. I mean, Do you have a sense, like you would say to me, if you were talking to a cloud customer and then they were looking for a deal, would you say, "Oh no, go to GCP and they're going to definitely cut you a deal because they're struggling in a third place"? I mean,
Yeah.
would you give advice like that, or is that outside your world?
I mean, it's outside of a little bit of the product world. I mean, there is, we
Yeah.
have plans down the road to do some level of arbitrage. We can say, okay, you're running some workloads in AWS, but you could be running cheaper in GCP,
Hmm.
right? But the reality of it is that it's not always that simple to just take a workload from one cloud provider and put it into another
Right.
cloud provider, especially if you're
Right.
leveraging their specialization,
Sure.
right? But I think the kind of advice that I can give on multiple clouds is that it gives you leverage on negotiation, right? So if you're in AWS and you have workloads in Azure, you can have the conversation to say, look, we could go all in Azure, right? As opposed to AWS. So that does
Right.
give you leverage. The flip side of what I would say is that if you're in a single cloud provider, you can maximize the committed usage as well, right? Because then you can say all of my $30 million in public cloud is all going to AWS, let's just say, as an
Hmm.
example. And then you can get a much bigger EDP, enterprise discount pricing, as a result. So I think it's a balancing game. The advice comes through the leveraging of the product. Right? So
Hmm.
teams can see what their spend is, whether it's GCP, whether it's AWS. If there is an analytics app that maybe cuts across AWS and GCP, they can start looking at the trending, the analytics, and some of the actionable recommendations, and they can start making some trade-offs on perhaps we should move workloads one way or another way.
Hmm. Well, let's look to the future of cloud costs. I mean, I think people are very concerned with that. And one of the things that happened for a number of years was the race to the bottom for the among the major
Right.
cloud vendors. It feels like that's not going the way it used to go. It's like the costs aren't falling the way they used to be. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But
Yeah.
the real question is, where are we going when it comes to the cost of multi-cloud computing?
Yeah, so I think you're right that it's not going to be necessarily a race to the bottom. You're already seeing specializations, right? What are the reasons why you are in a particular cloud? So people are picking clouds based on alignment of their customers or where their customers want them to be. And as an example, if you're a retail customer, there's certain cloud providers you're not going to go with, right? And if you're a Azure Office 360, then you might be more inclined to go into an Azure. And so I think the future is there's going to be more and more specialization. Certainly
Mm.
the big three we've talked about, but there is what I call sort of the next level and then the long tail, if you
Mm.
will. And I
Hmm.
think you will increasingly see that specialization. You might also see verticals. So there might be a travel industry vertical. You might see a financial vertical, that companies that specialize specifically with respect to the kind of workloads that are run within those vectors are going to be helpful. And I think people will be willing to pay a little more money because of that specialization and not having to sort of figure out how do you reel all that stuff in. I think
Hmm.
that's one. Two is
Can I
that,
ask you a question about
yeah,
that?
go ahead.
Do you
Absolutely.
think that one of the big three would offer those niche specialties, or would it be like a completely separate vendor might offer that
I do
specialty?
think that there is going to be an emergence down the road, depends on how far we're looking at. In 3 to 5 years, you will have some other specialized vendors. I think the big three are too big, candidly,
Mm.
to go deep into a particular vertical,
Okay.
right? So I think you already see an emergence of machine learning clouds where they're actually giving the whole stack, right? It's not just like you can have machine learning APIs, but you can do your whole development from the top to bottom just in that particular environment, and then they give you everything, right? They have the GPUs, they have all of that. I think you will see players emerge like that. Are they going to be at the scale of an AWS, GCP, Azure? Probably not. But
Hmm.
are they going to really serve the need of a particular use case extremely well? I believe that is going to be the case. It's just a matter, it's very hard for a larger company to focus like really, really deep into a particular vertical in a particular niche. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say maybe one of those niche players would actually be on top of AWS or Azure. In that the problem is AWS or Azure offers so many additional services like AI and machine learning, really advanced. And it seems hard for a niche player to ever get to that level of technological infrastructure.
That's true, and they can be, and they are built sometimes on the cloud providers. That is true, but then they are able to do that cloud cost arbitrage themselves, right? They might be on GCP, Azure, AWS, but they leverage the infrastructure in a way that is the most cost efficient to the end user, and they still are able to provide that higher level of services to them. It is true that AWS can provide other services as well. But as we've already talked about, the trend is multi-cloud. So this would be another additional service in addition to what they might already be using in AWS. So I think these are all trade-offs, right? I mean, the offer from an AWS would be, why would you go elsewhere? Right? We provide everything. But the challenge is that you can provide everything, but you cannot provide it at the level and at the specialization that another player might be able to provide. So it comes down to how sensitive you are to agility. I mean, just look at what's the need for a cloud cost management product like Yotascale, right? It's increasingly in more and more demand, right? But the cloud providers themselves have their own native tools that do cost management. So why are companies like Hulu and Zoom and Okta and Klarna and Compass and Jeffries leveraging a product like Yotascale? Because we specialize in cost management. We specialize in multi-cloud cost management. We specialize in container attribution. And that's very, very hard for a larger player to do.
Asim, I think you've said it. It's a lot of good stuff. It's going to be an interesting sector to follow. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise today.
Thank you for having me, James.